All right, I think almost everyone is here, so I'm gonna get started. Um, Feel free at any point to stop me, interrupt. You just unmute yourself to ask a question. You can use the chat. I'm gonna have the chat up, or use the raise hand function on the on the Zoom menu thing. So I know that you have a question and I can answer it. Sound good? Okay. All right. So intrinsicness. This is kind of a weird and niche thing, and obviously you all care about it a surprising amount, otherwise there would not be so many of you here. But it seems like, how can we leverage intrinsicness, and why is it even relevant? So the reason that I want to talk to you all about this is because intrinsicness is an argument that you can use to hold literally everything the neg says to a much higher standard, which makes it really helpful for you because you can screen out large chunks of neg arguments. And the beauty of it is there's basically no strategic penalty to making this argument, as long as you obviously don't commit entirely to intrinsicness. So it's basically a no risk option for you to integrate into your AF argument arsenal, since whenever you're behind on substance, you can always use it to screen out whatever the neg is talking about. So what is intrinsicness? So Merriam-Webster definition of the word intrinsic is belonging to the essential nature or construction of a thing. So intrinsic basically means if something is intrinsic to something else, that thing is inseparable from that thing, right? So in the same way that being, having ears and whiskers is intrinsic to a cat, right? When you picture a cat, you picture a certain set of attributes that are intrinsic to the idea of being a cat. It's these things that are inextricably linked to each other. In debate, when we talk about intrinsicness, what we're talking about is the idea that an action and an outcome are inextricably linked to each other. They're necessarily linked to each other. And so that means that the action, which is the plan, is both necessary and sufficient to cause the outcome. In other words, there's no separation, right, between the outcome and the action. The action has to happen for the outcome to occur, and the outcome cannot occur without the action having happened. So if link arguments for both sides are held to this standard, many arguments very quickly become irrelevant to whether the plan is desirable. For example, many of these things we've already kind of internalized and accepted. Let's say the AF says the USFG should defund the police, and the neg says the political costs of doing that would prevent infrastructure spending, which would be good. The AF intrinsicness argument in response would say that trading off with infrastructure spending is not an intrinsic part of defunding the police because the federal government could very easily do both. Is everyone kind of with me on what intrinsicness is? Top level. Okay. I think a lot of people are really worried about going for intrinsicness because they've never heard the case for intrinsicness explained very fully or defended very fully. And my goal for this elective is not to turn you all into little intrinsicness hacks or whatever who go for it at every available opportunity. What I want is for, because a lot of what I'm going to say, I think they're good arguments because I'm a bit of an intrinsicness hack, little known fact. But a lot of judges, it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle to get them to vote on intrinsicness because many judges just are averse to any argument that is labeled with the word intrinsicness without super understanding why or what the problems with that argument is. And so getting people to think about intrinsicness is going to be an uphill battle, and it'll take time if it will ever happen at all. And instead, what I kind of want this to be is a break glass if needed theory tool, as well as kind of a fascinating debate trivia discussion that hopefully you can learn something about how arguments work and apply that to some other context. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that while intrinsicness is, a thing that typically people assume is not very popular, or does not have very much buy-in, it's actually surprisingly common and well accepted in a wide variety of debate contexts. If the F says the USFG should reduce its funding for the police, and the neg responds by saying that controversial court rulings hurt the court's legitimacy, there is a very obvious affirmative response to this that I'm sure every single 2A would immediately make, which is, this objection does not apply to congressional action, which is what would happen for defunding the police. What that argument is actually saying is that controversial rulings are not intrinsic to the federal government defunding the police. because the plan can happen without the court making a controversial ruling if Congress simply does it. This is an intrinsicness argument, but everybody uses this argument all the time. Every single court aff or every single aff that says USFG in the plan with a court actor is going to no-link politics by saying they're the court. This is typical. Nobody has a theoretical problem with this, except for A-spec, which everyone agrees no one cares. So, you know, interesting. We got this example of intrinsicness everyone is using. Do we have any others? Why, we do. If the AF says the USFG should reduce its funding for the police because doing so would boost Trump's political capital and enable him to pass an infrastructure package, the 1NC would certainly read a counterplan to just pass the infrastructure package. There's no way the NEG would not come up with that, right? If the AF is reading a politics advantage, the NEG is obviously going to counterplan to just do whatever the politics advantage is, right? What they are really saying is that infrastructure spending is not an intrinsic advantage to the plan because you can do infrastructure spending without passing the plan. Interesting. We got, you know, so counterplans. It seems like counterplans are very similar to intrinsicness arguments, and that is a burden that the affirmative is held to, but for some reason, the NEG just gets to do whatever they want, and they don't have to face this kind of logical test. Interesting. Any other examples? Why, yes. If the AF says the USFG should eliminate qualified immunity, and the NEG says that doing so would clog the courts, and they also read a uniqueness counterplan that throws a bunch of money at the courts to fix court clog, and the AF, you know, the AF, if they are thinking about the debate at all, would immediately be like, perm do both. If we combine the plan and the counterplan, we can infuse the court system with all this money and resources, and that enables it to cope with the caseload that is presented by the plan. What they're actually saying is, again, that clogged courts are not intrinsic to the plan because you can avoid clogged courts without forgoing the plan by just doing the counterplan too. So interesting. We got advantages. They're always held to the intrinsicness standard for some reason. Some disads are held to the intrinsicness standard always, like disads that can, you know, that link based off of normal means determinations. And also, sometimes we can just use intrinsicness whenever we want, but only when there's a counterplan. So, seems like a weird set of situations in which we're applying this test for the logical relationship between two different things, which would seem to be just a basic thing about causality. So, oops, I kind of went out of order, but whatever. So, people scoff at intrinsicness a bunch, right? They're like, oh, you know, it's like the 2AC said intrinsicness, whatever, like, fuck them. But obviously they're not actually scoffing at intrinsicness, because if they were actually scoffing at intrinsicness, none of the things that I said just now would be as common sense as they are to everybody, right? All of those things are applications of literally the exact same logic as the logic of an intrinsicness theory argument, but they're applied in a specific set of conditions that everyone seems to agree makes them legitimate. So it must be that there is something about the particular intrinsicness scenario that we're interested in, which is the example that I gave at the very, very beginning, a 2AC making an intrinsicness argument against a disadvantaged link like the politics dissent. And something about that scenario must be different from the examples that are commonly accepted in a way that makes it uniquely problematic. So what is that thing that makes it uniquely problematic? Well, it seems like the main objection to such an intrinsicness argument is primarily a theory argument about affirmative fiat. So this objection to intrinsicness takes several different forms. But the general idea is that the scope of what the AF can fiat is constrained by the plan, and it's constrained by the topic. The plan constrains affirmative fiat because the plan sets the focus of the debate, and intrinsicness arguments under that formulation move the target by changing what the AF is defending. You've probably heard this response to intrinsicness as just like a gut thing that 2Ns spit out, just like, oh, it's a moving target. Very confusing, argumentative responsibility. If it's moving, how can we possibly shoot it? You know, it's like, it's hard because it's on the move. The topic constrains affirmative fiat because topicality is an affirmative burden of proof, and because the AF's fiat power is derived from the resolution. So that combination of objections kind of helps us get at a little bit of the distinction between some of this stuff. If the AF's fiat power is constrained by the plan and it's constrained by the topic, it seems like a lot of these unpredictability things that people associate with intrinsicness uniquely emerge out of the the unique randomness of the app just being able to tack on literally whatever they want to their plan to resolve some extraneous stuff. So I would submit to you that this argument is thoroughly ill-conceived and wrong. But unpacking exactly why this position is wrong will take a little bit of work, and we can do it at multiple levels. So the first level that I want to talk about is the very, very fundamental level of what fiat is. So when we fiat something, we are imagining a world in which that thing happens in order to decide whether that thing is good or bad. We do this to help us determine whether the statement that the USFG should do the resolution is true. Does that make sense to everyone? We're just imagining that a thing happens, right? So a couple of things that I imagine will come off as hot takes can be inferred from this definition, but I feel like based on what fiat is, these things are just self-evidently true. One is that the theory argument that we just talked about a fiat kind of rests on the assumption that a fiat comes from the resolution, that the affirmative would not be able to invoke fiat if the resolution did not have the word should in it. That is total nonsense, because the fiat power, contrary to popular belief, does not in fact derive from anywhere. It is a thing that every human is capable of doing with their brain when they consider whether stuff is good or bad. We know that fiat power works this way and that it doesn't come from the resolution because judges endorse non-resolutional normative statements literally all the time. They vote for counterplans, they vote for permutations, they vote for critiques and critical alternatives, and critical affirmatives even. They also can imagine things that have nothing to do with the resolution at all. Like right now, I'm thinking about what would happen if the federal government banned all the cats. You can't stop me. I'm just doing it. I didn't need a resolution to tell me that I have the power to fiat this in my head, because it literally just involves thinking about what would happen if something occurred. So it does not make any sense to be like, the judge is literally jurisdictionally powerless to imagine stuff that is happening that is not the resolution. That is nonsense. Fiat power does not come from anywhere. Fiat power does, though, have something to do with the resolution, which is that it is a way that we think about the resolution to help us determine whether or not to endorse it, right? So fiat power, as it relates to the resolution, helps us kind of convert the should statement into a will statement for the provisional purpose of thinking about what would happen if whatever thing occurred, right? So fiat's obviously not the only way that we test if the resolution is true, because again, there's this discussion of critiques, which looks at the resolution from a little bit of a different perspective, but it is one of several tools that we have to determine if the resolutional statement that the USFG should do something is a true statement. And so what follows from this view of fiat, which is a little bit more pragmatic than the typical view of fiat that just defines it rigidly as a thing emerging from the word should, is that we can use the analytical tool of imagining the consequences of stuff in potentially many different, potentially boundless ways, as long as the way that we're doing it is done to help us determine if the resolution is a true statement. Does that make sense? Okay, so another thing that should be obvious from this definition of fiat that is also potentially a bit of an intrinsicness hot take is about the discussion of the role of the judge. So are you all familiar with this discussion in the context of intrinsicness at all? So basically the debate within intrinsicness is frequently the AF will stand up and be like, the judge is a policymaker. And if the judge is, or the judge is the USFG, and if the judge is the USFG, then the judge is empowered to do both the plan and whatever other thing that the dissent is about, because the judge is the USFG and they can do whatever they want. The neg will respond and be like, wrong. The judge is not the USFG. The judge is a single policymaker within the USFG. So the judge can endorse one policy, but they have to take into account the political costs of their endorsement. Does that make sense? So in one universe, if you're the whole USFG, if you're role-playing as the whole USFG, whatever that means, considering how, the USFG is made up of literally millions of people, so what would that even look like? It doesn't really, whatever, who cares? So if you're role-playing as the USFG, you can kind of do both the plan and whatever other thing. If you're role-playing as a single person, your powers are a little bit more limited. You might not be able to also do the dissad. It's unclear why you should get to do the AF in that universe either, because obviously the single decision maker would never be able to do the AF. But, whatever. But if you look at what fiat is, obviously the judge is not any of that. Like, because exactly what Holland said, which is the judge is the judge. The judge is a person, they're sitting there, they just heard a 1AC and some other speeches, and they're going to vote at the end for who they thought was right about the statement of the resolution. So the judge is obviously not role-playing as the SFG. The judge is not the president or whatever. You don't have to address the judge as Mr. President unless your judge has some particularly weird power delusion that you need to adapt to. You know, there's no Mr. Speaker going on. It's like the judge is a person. You all probably address them as judge because you don't like learning people's names. But it's like, yes, their role is they're sitting there. Their role there is to judge the debate. And in that context, their degree of empowerment with respect to the should statement is literally holding an opinion. When a judge is like, I voted AF because I think that the federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform, they are registering an opinion with you that says, I believe that the federal government should enact criminal justice reform. They are equally empowered by their position to hold an opinion about literally any other thing that the federal government should do. Does this make sense? So a lot of people think that this informed bystander business is a neg argument because the judge is not empowered to do the dissad or whatever. But that does not make any sense because if the judge is not empowered to do the dissad and that is relevant in any way, then obviously Fiat is illusory and everyone should be losing to the Fiat double bind because the judge is not empowered to do the AF because they're an informed bystander. So again, it's like, it literally is irrelevant what any decision maker who's involved in the debate is able to literally instrumentally accomplish. What matters is what normative statements, in other words, what should statements they can direct at the federal government. Does that make sense so far? So that's kind of the discussion about, yeah, what's up?
I was going to ask you, so you said that when an AF uses the word should in their plan text, that means that they're not allowed to use Fiat? Can you explain that again? I didn't really understand.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, so Fiat is just, so when we say the AF has fiated something, what we mean by this is they have made a statement that to determine if it's a good idea or not, we have to imagine what would happen if that statement came true. So when I say the federal government should enact criminal justice reform, right? So I've put should in my plain text. The way that a judge would go about figuring out whether or not I am right that the federal government should enact criminal justice reform is by thinking to themselves, what would happen if the federal government enacted substantial criminal justice reform? They would imagine some good things. They would imagine some bad things. And then from that, they would arrive at a conclusion that is like, either yes, they should enact it, or no, they should not enact it. So putting should in your plan text, you know, it does not obviously lock you out of Fiat. It is something that you could only evaluate through the use of Fiat, which is imagining what would happen if something took place. But it's also, that has nothing to do with the word should. It would be equally, like the exact same analytical tool would be applied if the plan said, it would be good if substantial criminal justice reform were enacted, right? That statement would also, we would also assess that statement using the, you know, the analytical tool of Fiat, even though that statement has nothing to do with the word should, right? Because Fiat, again, is literally just imagining that something happens and thinking about if it would be good or bad, right? Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep. I guess I'll pause here. Are there any other questions about what I've said so far? I realize this might be a weird place to start, but how this relates to intrinsicness, I promise I will arrive, even though I'm going about this in a bit of a circuitous, you know, way. Okay. Everyone's on the same page with me about Fiat. Okay. Another thing to consider here. So remember, this theoretical issue that we're addressing is one, so we've addressed the argument that affirmative Fiat is limited to this specific set of instances intrinsically by the nature of how stuff is written, right? So, because again, Fiat does not derive from any particular thing. There's no jurisdictional barrier to judges wanting or imagining whatever they want. So Another problem with this theoretical objection to intrinsicness is that it assumes that when we advance an intrinsicness argument, we are modifying our advocacy somehow. That we, so like this moving target accusation assumes that when we make an intrinsicness argument, it's almost like we're tacking stuff onto our plan text and then like shifting it in ways that nobody could possibly guess. All of that assumes that an intrinsicness argument is an advocacy, that I'm saying do the plan and do the other thing. But is it in fact an advocacy? It is not at all in any way an advocacy, is the answer to that question. Think about a permutation. You've probably heard when people are kicking a counterplan the phrase, permutation is a test of competition, not an advocacy. What that means is when a permutation is advanced, the AF is not saying, now my advocacy has now become the plan plus whatever the counterplan is. What the AF is saying is that the net benefit can be avoided without foregoing the plan. So the permutation is advancing an intrinsicness argument about the link to the net benefit. So permutation, in a sense, is a kind of intrinsicness argument. Is a permutation an advocacy? It is not, because what a permutation actually is a link answer. It is a piece of link defense about the negative's net benefit. The neg is saying that the plan is bad for something. The AF is responding by saying even if in certain worlds the plan is bad for something, the remedial action of the counterplan when combined with the plan can nullify the plan's negative effect, which means that the link is not intrinsic. An intrinsicness argument that works without a counterplan is advancing the same exact claim, except what it is doing to advance this claim is not dependent on the existence of a counterplan. But logically, the structure of that argument is exactly the same. It's not adding anything to the advocacy. It's just saying that there is not a strong link between the plan and the disadvantage that is being advanced by the negative. So what are the implications of acknowledging that intrinsicness is not in fact an advocacy or a change in the advocacy of the AF? Implication 1 is an intrinsicness argument is not a moving target. Nothing is moving. If the neg said the plan is bad, that is still relevant because the AF is still defending their entire plan. Much like a severance permutation is illegitimate, a severance intrinsicness argument that did other stuff and not the whole plan would not be a reason why the plan is a good idea, because it would not be proof of the fact that the best policy option includes the entire plan. Does that make sense? So if an intrinsicness argument has to include the entire plan, the AF cannot kick out of their plan. The neg is guaranteed to be able to say the plan is a bad idea. There is no moving target because you're just tacking stuff on that is extra. You're not getting rid of any of the core stuff that the neg's offense is based on. Yeah? Does this make sense? Second is a lot of people accuse intrinsicness arguments of being argumentatively irresponsible because you can just throw stuff out willy-nilly. If it's not an advocacy, that's not the case because the AF is not jettisoning anything. They're still committed 100% to their original proposal. And if you jettison an intrinsicness argument, remember, intrinsicness is exactly the same logical argument that is being advanced by any counterplan about an advantage and that is being advanced by any permutation. When the neg is like, intrinsicness arguments are argumentatively irresponsible because the AF can kick them, what they're saying is the intellectual equivalent of saying that permutations must be read unconditionally. It is literally the same. That is nonsense. Obviously, for reasons that are clear, permutations can be read conditionally because they are not advocacies, they are no-link arguments. In the same way that it would make no sense for the neg to be like, you kicked out of your no-link argument when you were answering the disad, it also makes no sense to say you kicked out of this intrinsicness thing, so that's cheating. Any reason why counterplan conditionality is good is also a justification for this. Finally, the fact that intrinsicness is not an advocacy avoids most of the reasons why the extra topical fiat components of intrinsicness could be objectionable, because the AF cannot use intrinsicness to present additional advantages. Since intrinsicness is not a component of the AF's advocacy, you can't vote AF on the advantages to the intrinsic, to the extra topical part outweigh the disad. That's not an RFD that is available to the judge because the AF is not advocating for the intrinsic stuff. The stuff the intrinsicness argument is adding onto the plan. Because what that stuff is doing is, again, purely playing the role of link defense. It is not making an offensive argument whatsoever. The third reason why this theoretical argument about affirmative fiat is wrong is the definition of should. Here is a definition of should. It's used an auxiliary function to express obligation, propriety, or expediency. So auxiliary function means it's not a verb that stands by itself. It's a verb that you tack before another verb. So should do something, should do whatever. Should defund the police. Should enact substantial criminal justice reform, etc. The key ideas here, obligation, propriety, and expediency, suggest some different implications for how we might think about the role of the affirmative. So let's start with obligation and propriety. This is the idea that the action presented by the plan is either morally obligatory or it's otherwise just proper in general. Let's say a debate is occurring on the floor of the Senate where one senator says that the US federal police should not engage in racial profiling, and another senator responds to this appeal by saying that any loosening of US policing would increase the risk that criminals slip through the cracks. The problem with that argument is not just that it is morally reprehensible. There's also a secondary issue, which is that the abstract goal of catching criminals is not a justification for racial profiling. Theoretically, you could increase the rate of law enforcement to solve crime. Racial profiling is completely unnecessary to accomplish the goal that has been set out by the second senator. The goal of catching criminals is therefore not a reason US federal police should not end racial profiling. Instead, it is a reason that the US federal police should also increase their rate of law enforcement. Same thing with the politics disad. If defunding the police is morally obligatory or proper, right, as is suggested by this obligation or propriety definition, right, that means that the US should do it, and the plan's statement is therefore true, and the affirmative therefore wins. If the neg introduces a politics disad, they are saying that it is also obligatory or proper for the government to spend money on infrastructure, right? The culmination of that is that the US should defund the police because there is a moral obligation to do so, just as it should fund infrastructure spending because there's a moral obligation to do so, or a propriety argument to do so, right? And so the AF wins because they have proven that the US should defund policing. The neg politics disad is not a reason why they should not defund policing. It is a reason why the federal government should also do something else. Intrinsicness. It flows from the resolution. It's right there. It's in the word should. Another way to think about this is through a parallel between an earlier example that I gave about the possible AF agent trickery, right? So this idea of no linking a disad by saying that you're a different agent that you originally were going to, right? So court legitimacy disad is not a relevant objection to the police defunding AF because the actor of that AF might not be the court, so it's not intrinsic, right? For the same reason, the agenda trade-off disad is not a reason not to defund the police because defunding the police could occur after the agenda item passes, right? If defunding the police can occur after the agenda item, then the agenda trade-off disad is not a reason not to defund the police. It's a reason not to defund the police now, but the plan does not say that we need to defund the police now. It says we need to defund the police. And if you think that there is an obligation by the AF to defend defunding the police now, then you like the delay counter plan and you suck. So don't think that. Does that all make sense? Okay. The third word that is used in this definition is expediency. And here the things that we need to consider for determining whether the USFG should enact criminal justice reform, or in other words, whether it would be expedient for the United States federal government to enact criminal justice reform, they're a little bit broader, right? So political costs could prevent something from being an expedient thing to do, for sure, right? This definition kind of toes the line of eliminating fiat also, because something could be expedient if it's inexpedient if it's unlikely to happen. So that alone suggests that caring about expediency is not particularly well suited to modern debate. But even this definition kind of begs the question of the rest of the plan text, since, again, like in the example I just gave, even if it's not expedient to do the plan now, that doesn't mean the plan is bad, only that it should be done later. Does that make sense? As an aside, the stuff that I've just described is what your framing page should say. Your framing page should not say no disads because links are fake and because causality is broken. Your framing page should say that the resolution poses a moral question that is not implicated by the majority of the disads that the other team is advancing. I'm going to give you an example of a card that I cut on the immigration topic that I think expresses this question very clearly. The entire chunk of text here is not necessarily as relevant, but the clearest line where it talks about this is the idea that in most cases, the reasons that are decisive need not aggregate because certain reasons rule out others from consideration at all without outweighing them. For example, when deciding a trial, a jury mustn't consider the benefits from a guilty verdict, only the evidence. So this card, which applies this particular argument to immigration, is doing the exact kind of analysis that I just talked about. It's saying, based on the question that is asked by the resolution, there were a certain set of reasons for why the government should or should not do a thing that are relevant to deciding whether the resolution is true, and others that are irrelevant. If the resolution is asking a moral question of whether it is morally obligatory for the federal government to do something, it's completely irrelevant whether doing that thing might cause some political follow-on that is not beneficial, right? And this is not an argument for why deontology is a better theory than consequentialism, right? It is an argument that consequentialism of the kind that the politics dissad discusses does not answer the resolutional question. It is outside the scope of the question that is posed by the resolution to talk about whether the political fallout of the plan would be good or bad, because it does not prove that the action of the plan is intrinsically improper or not obligatory. Does that make sense? Okay. This is an extension that I wrote for this piece of evidence that kind of describes some of the stuff in the context of immigration that I'm not going to go over. I'll post this PowerPoint later, but you can look at what I wrote there. So far, most of what we've talked about falls under the kind of broad area of logic. The idea that it is illogical to assess a non-intrinsic disad as a reason to not do the plan. But there are some other reasons that intrinsicness is good that you should also bring up in addition to this idea of logic that I've already spent half an hour rambling about. Thing one is reciprocity, which kind of gets at the idea of fairness. The current model of debate holds affirmative and negative arguments to a fundamentally rigged and different standard of quality. Most of what the negative says the affirmative causes, if the AF read it as advantages, would not even be remotely relevant to deciding a debate because the neg would immediately counterplan out of it. Most neg arguments do not have a necessity component to their links. Very few of them say that the plan is on its, sufficiency and necessity are often missing, right? So it's like, oftentimes, the neg will not be able to demonstrate that no matter what countervailing pressures occur, the AF causes the bad thing that the negative is talking about. For fairness and reciprocity reasons, the AF and the neg should be held to the same standards of causality and germaneness. The fact that the neg, gets counterplans, but the fact that the AF does not get intrinsicness arguments to respond gives the neg an upper hand. And this also connects back to the logic discussion we were just having, since it makes it so when the judge is making a decision, they're using a different standard for causality across the different flows, which doesn't make any sense. And the idea of causality should be held static from across all the different pages that we're talking about. So that's the first additional thing on top of logic, and that's reciprocity. The next argument that you should make about intrinsicness is the quality of disads. Disads mostly suck. If the neg was held to the same quality of disad as the AF was held to advantages, the neg would be forced to elevate the specificity and the quality of their research, since their link arguments would have to be held to a higher standard. This would make negs better. It would make AFs better because they would be forced to respond to better negs, and it makes for better debates all around. The last major reason why we should care about intrinsicness is that it's the most real world. Whenever you're a decision maker and you can endorse a proposal and some other proposals to correct for some of that proposal's downsides, they often do not hesitate to do so. T.A. McKinney wrote a very good 1991 article called Rehabilitating Intrinsicness, which in many of its elements has not aged very well because, some parts of its proposals are a little bit dated. But it includes a great anecdote in which T.A. talks about how he asked a CIA presenter whose lecture he attended why the U.S. would crack down on Soviet spying if doing so would cause instability by damaging their economy. And the CIA presenter was like, well, we can fix their economy by doing other stuff like loans and aid without letting them steal our highly sensitive secrets. And that argument is an intrinsicness argument. He's saying the disadvantage of Soviet economic growth is not intrinsic to cracking down on espionage because we can boost the Soviet economy through other means without the risks associated with allowing them to spy on us. So real world decision makers contribute, think in these terms all the time. So the last chunk of this, I'm going to talk about dealing with objections to intrinsicness. Before I do that, any questions about the reasons why intrinsicness is a proactively good model? Any at all?
Okay, so when you was talking about like the definition of should and why Fiat theory doesn't exist, what were can you tell me, because you gave a lot of examples of the court and why they shouldn't fund the CJR, but I really didn't understand how that's linked to this resolution. Can you go more in depth on why it's not an advocacy, and that why the pure definition of should is a reason why AF theory doesn't exist?
Right. So, here, let me think about this. So, So there was a lot of components to that question. I'll try to tackle it in its core components, right? So the main thing I'm trying to get at here with respect to this topic specifically, and so I'll use this example of the specifying a different agent to clarify this a little bit for you. So the status, let's say the AF, we're reading an AF on the criminal justice topic. We're saying defund the federal police, right? And so the AF says defund the federal police, which is something that Congress can do. The neg responds by saying the court, when it makes controversial rulings, hurts its legitimacy. So since the AF has said the federal government should defund the police, this could potentially link since the court is part of the federal government. Does this make sense? It's a thing that could potentially link, depending on how the plan works. But the AF could respond to that by advancing an intrinsicness argument, which says, even if it could potentially link, it doesn't necessarily link. It's very easy to have the United States federal government defund the police in a way that avoids the cost of court legitimacy, because Congress can just do it instead of the courts. This gets at the discussion of the rest of the stuff that I was saying, because it means that the potential risk of court legitimacy is not a reason why the United States federal government should not defund the police, right? It's a completely peripheral question because it addresses a potential cost that could result, but if that cost can easily be avoided and the best policy world still includes the federal government defunding the police, the neg has not proven that the United States federal government should not defund the police. Does that make sense? Or does that help?
So basically saying that just because like the court has enough power to like make decisions which indefinitely would hurt its legitimacy it doesn't give a reason why you should not defund the police. Just more so saying there's another actor that can do it.
Yeah, exactly. Or another example, I can give an example from like the day-to-day world. You know, let's say the plan is to go to McDonald's, and the dissed is there are really terrible there are really terrible chicken foods at McDonald's, and if you go to McDonald's and buy chicken food, it'll make you sick, right? So we have the McDonald's app and the sickness dissed. The sickness dissed is very easy to avoid, even if you go to McDonald's, by just not buying anything from McDonald's that has chicken in it. So the sickness dissed is not an intrinsic reason why going to McDonald's is bad, right? So the neg has not proven through their use of the sickness dissed that we should not go to McDonald's. They've only proven that a specific form of that proposal would not be good.
Okay, I understand.
In the same way, you know, a certain form of defunding the police, which is the one done by the courts, could be bad. But the Congress version is good. Or a certain form of doing the plan might link to the politics dissed and result in a trade-off with infrastructure spending. But that doesn't prove that doing the plan is bad, because you could do the plan and do infrastructure spending. So it is not a reason why we should not do the plan. It's a reason why we should also fund infrastructure. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Another question. I didn't catch what you said on the more real world on other reasons why it's good.
Mm-hmm. So that argument is just that real world decision makers think in these terms. If they're faced with a cost and they can get rid of that cost by doing something else, they're usually going to do that instead of giving up on the proposal altogether. So like, for example, if there's a proposal to spend some money and someone is like, that involves going into debt, the obvious response would be just don't go into debt. You can cut the money from somewhere else, or you can raise taxes, right? Congress makes calculations like that all the time, and that is basically an intrinsicness argument to avoid going into debt.
I have a question also. So since it's not an advocacy, does that mean that the neg can't garner offense off of whatever your other thing is? Like if you say just take money from something else, does that mean they can't like garner offense off of taking money from this place is bad for these reasons? Or could they do that?
They could do that, but it would not be a reason why the plan is bad. So like in the final calculation, that cannot be a reason why the AF loses, right? Because it's not like the AF has amended their plan to do this thing. It's a reason why the intrinsicness remedy that the AF has proposed to this dissed fails, right? So you could be like, for example, if you read a dissed and the AF is like not intrinsic, you can do the plan and this other thing, and that fixes the problem. And the neg is like, that other thing that you just proposed doing sucks. Either because it doesn't resolve the original link or because it causes a bunch of other problems. They are pushing back on your argument that the dissed is not intrinsic by illustrating that there are intrinsic costs associated to doing the plan or things that remedy the problems with the plan.
Okay.
But at the end of the debate, if it turns out that the intrinsicness argument is really, really bad, the judge cannot, because again, like I said, it's not like the intrinsicness argument is unconditional. The intrinsicness argument by its very nature, much like a permutation, if the neg read a bunch of dissents to a permutation against a counterplan, the F can't just lose because they extended a permutation. The perm gets automatically judge kicked if it's bad. And in the same way, the intrinsicness argument gets automatically judge kicked if it's bad, if the neg read a bunch of dissents to the intrinsicness remedy.
Okay, so that kind of thing could implicate the intrinsicness debate, but not the debate overall if you don't vote for the intrinsicness argument.
Right. Unless you are one of those people who think that intrinsicness arguments should be unconditional, which I don't agree with, but that is a thing that some people say.
Okay.
I'm a bit confused on, so when someone, like when the neg would read a politics dissent, they would read a link that's like, if the plan happens, like the infrastructure bill wouldn't happen. So why wouldn't that be intrinsic? Because if the plan happens, an infrastructure bill won't happen.
Well, think back to our definition of intrinsicness, which is that the outcome and the action are inextricable from each other, right? There are many ways that we can imagine these outcome and action being extricated from each other in a way that would not be the case of other stuff. So an example of an intrinsic dissent under this model could be that an action to sanction Russia could be bad for Russia relations, right? That is an intrinsic consequence of sanctioning Russia. It automatically makes Russia like us less than they would have otherwise. But this action, not, this consequence in the infrastructure scenario, not intrinsic at all, both because we can do the plan later and avoid the cost. We can have another actor in the federal government do the plan and avoid the cost. And we can have the same actor do the plan and do the thing that is the cost to avoid the cost. So many, many worlds that include the plan are the best policy outcome because they include both the plan and the thing that you've asserted that there's a trade-off with. If the consequence was actually intrinsic, those combinations would be impossible. Much like a mutually exclusive counterplan, an intrinsic disad is not possible to avoid in worlds where the plan has occurred. Whereas this disad is clearly possible to avoid because the link is contingent on a finite political will or on the plan happening in a particular moment in time. Does that make sense?
So Truth, with relations DAs, like last year with, for example, the Japan relations DA for like the Taiwan AF, if the neg would make arguments like the AF is sort of a linchpin because it makes Japan think that the US will pull out of other commitments like troops or something, and then the AF was like, it's not intrinsic because we could bolster that, the US could declare that Taiwan is a separate issue, etc. Would those be reasons for why the DA is not intrinsic? And like, if so, why can't the AF just like make a bunch of other uniqueness claims that bolster relations and likewise across other DAs?
Yeah, well, so intrinsicness is not a 0-1 issue, right? Much like a permutation with a counterplan, there are gradations of links. And the better a link you have to the specific plan, the better your answer to that question is. If you actually have really, really good cards that say the plan is a linchpin of relations, then none of that is going to matter because even if the spillover arguments can be repaired to some degree, you can argue that the plan creates anxiety that still contaminates how those other issues are viewed. And you can say that the plan itself is viewed as a critical component of relations, which Japan would be fundamentally upset by. No amount of intrinsicing can reduce that link to 0, which is why it's an intrinsic consequence of doing the plan. In the same way, if the AF read a relations advantage, the neg could counterplan to do a bunch of other stuff to boost relations, to which the AF would respond by saying the AF is key to relations. It's exactly the same, and disads can work exactly the same way if there are adequate cards that say that the plan is key to relations. If it's not an intrinsic cost because you can do the plan and avoid the harm to relations. So it's like, yeah, the answer is you need to cut better cards if the plan is key to relations, which makes your disad better, which is good. That should happen. Also, some of these concerns are going to be addressed by some other stuff that I'm going to talk about in a second about counterinterpretations for intrinsicness, which is a thing that nobody does, but can actually screen out a bunch of the stuff that the affirmative, the like boogeyman that the affirmative brings up all the time, or the negative brings up all the time. Other questions about what I've just said? Okay, I'm going to wrap this up by talking about some counterinterpretations that you can use to screen out some bad forms of intrinsicness and solve some negative offense. So why can we do this? This seems made up. Well, we have counterinterpretations on theory for counterplans, and counterplans are intrinsicness tests. So we have theory to determine what are legitimate intrinsicness tests on the neg. We should have some theory to determine what are legitimate intrinsicness tests on the AF. We can use these ideas to screen out the most abusive forms of intrinsicness and just keep the ones that we like so that we can avoid linking to hypotheticals like what Emily just brought up. So I'm going to offer you 5 potential counterinterpretations that you can use on an intrinsicness debate to screen out what the other team is talking about. Counterinterpretation number 1 is topical intrinsicness tests only. Topical intrinsicness tests only. What that means is that the intrinsic thing that we tack onto the plan has to be constrained to the scope of the topic. This is one of the narrower counterinterpretations you can make, but it screens out a lot of what the neg is concerned about. Remember, the AF's fundamental complaint, or the neg's fundamental complaint about intrinsicness is an affirmative fiat theory argument, which says that the AF's fiat power derives from the resolution. if we constrain our intrinsicness argument to the resolution, we are not exceeding the scope of affirmative fiat power. The logic behind this standard is that a disad that proves the plan is bad but does not prove the resolution is bad is not a reason to vote neg, since the plan is supposed to serve as a proxy for figuring out if the resolution is good. This solves predictability, limits, and expands the scope of ground for the neg, because the neg should have prepped against all of these intrinsicness arguments, since they're all examples of topical action. So this is the most limited and potentially least useful for the AF. But when it is useful, it's really good. For example, if the AF were to say criminal justice reform that is limited trades off with criminal justice reform that is comprehensive, and you said intrinsicness, you can do both, then this standard would do you a lot of good. The second interpretation is logical intrinsicness tests only. Now, logical seems pretty subjective, so what are we talking about? What we're talking about is something I haven't really talked about much here, but a big part of the intrinsicness debate historically has revolved around the idea of logical and empirical intrinsicness. Logical intrinsicness is stuff that does not require evidence to prove. So that's like the politics disad, where the neg has already said for you that, by the terms of their argument, it is self-evident that the federal government doing X thing would resolve the entire trade-off. So with politics disads, we're usually talking about logical intrinsicness. Empirical intrinsicness is broader. It's the kind of stuff that Emily's really worried about with the relations disad. They can be anything, and the AF would have to read cards to prove that they solved the link. For example, the neg might read a disad that says the plan for some reason destroys food security, and the AF might respond with an intrinsicness argument that proposes to do the plan and increases food subsidies by billions of dollars, and reads cards that say the food subsidies solve food security. This is a line that we have kind of not cared about in counterplan land. And to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this line, but it has the advantage of limiting intrinsicness down to exactly the context where the AF usually wants to talk about it, which is with politics disads. It makes intrinsicness way more limited and predictable, since it would only ever be brought up when the neg has said the USFG doing something is guaranteed to solve something. It solves the proliferation of random additional shit to solve trade-offs. So, and the neg will be relatively prepared, because when they advance an argument like this, they will know that it's coming because of the nature of logical intrinsicness. The third counterinterpretation is the notion that intrinsicness tests must have a stable text and they must be limited in number. This school of thought applies some of the same limits to the number of intrinsicness tests that most debaters have agreed to apply to neg counterplans. This is basically conditionality for intrinsicness tests. And under this interpretation, the AF would have to present a text for their intrinsicness argument in the 2AC, much like they have to present a permutation text that specifies what the intrinsicness argument does, and they are only allowed a finite number of them, which solves reclarification, it solves some of the moving target stuff, whatever. The fourth intrinsicness test is proportionally utopian intrinsicness. I think this interpretation is dumb, but it's talked about a lot in the papers that discuss intrinsicness over the course of when this was being debated, so I feel compelled to bring it up, but I don't really think you should ever say it. This argument says the neg, or the AF, can only say intrinsicness tests that are about as utopian as the policy options that have already been discussed. It's kind of like the logical approach, or it gets at the same notion, but it only lets in other stuff that is about the same level of crazy as what the disad has already contemplated. So like against the food security disad, you can't throw in an intrinsicness test that spends like trillions of dollars on food subsidies, because that's very utopian. It's unrealistic. Obviously, the problem with this is, what do we mean by proportionally utopian? There's no possible way that you could ever tell this, so you should not say this. The more precise version of getting at the same idea of proportionally utopian is same actor intrinsicness tests only. And I like this a lot better because it has a lot of the same benefits as number 4, but it gets rid of a lot of the concerns with number 4, which is that it's very clear what we're talking about. Basically, we're saying if the federal government can do something else to fix the problem, then we can imagine that the federal government does something else. It would avoid the problem of like sanctions AF against Russia, disad hurts Russia relations, intrinsicness argument, do the AF and Russia should not be offended. That's obviously ridiculous. No decision maker would ever consider such a thing. So basically we're screening out agent intrinsicness arguments, much like we would screen out agent counterplans when, we're talking about intrinsicness in that context. Any questions about these counterinterpretations? or why you would use them, or why they're beneficial.
Can you go over the topical intrinsicness again?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. So the topical intrinsicness counterinterpretation says that whenever the 2AC brings up an extra thing that could be tacked onto the plan that resolves the disad, that extra thing has to be topical. So if the AF is defund the police, and the neg says that the plan trades off with infrastructure spending because it has political costs, a topical intrinsicness test would not be able to advance an intrinsicness argument against this disad because infrastructure spending is not topical. But if the neg said limited criminal justice reform trades off with comprehensive criminal justice reform because it diffuses the political momentum or whatever, then the AF could be like, comprehensive criminal justice reform is topical, so your disad does not disprove the topic because you could just do the plan and comprehensive reform. So you have not disproven the desirability of the topic using your disad. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Also, what was that stuff you was talking about on the logical intrinsicness? He was like empirical intrinsicness. What? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, for sure. So logical and empirical intrinsicness are the two categories. Logical intrinsicness is when the structure of the negative argument makes it self-evident that it is not intrinsic. So an example of that is infrastructure spending. It is self-evident based on what the neg says that if the federal government were to fund infrastructure, that would resolve their concern, right? There's no debate about it because the neg has already said that whatever the AF is trading off with would be resolved if the federal government just funded infrastructure. That is a logical argument that is based on the facts already introduced. An empirical argument is one that you would need to read cards or provide additional data to prove that it solves the link. So for example, if the AF said, defund the police, and the neg said that trades off with infrastructure reform because that's good for the economy, and the AF was like, not intrinsic, you can defund the police and pass a stimulus package that does not include infrastructure, that would be an empirical claim. You would have to prove through evidence that a stimulus package could solve the economy even if we don't have infrastructure spending, right? So logical intrinsicness, a self-evident argument. Empirical intrinsicness, something you need to prove. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right, nice. I'm going to wrap up by bringing up a couple of final points that people bring up to object to intrinsicness, and then I'm going to field any questions, and then we'll wrap up. So last couple of objections. One is intrinsicness kills all disads. I kind of already addressed this. Killing all advantages was never a compelling reason to reject counterplans. So why would it be a compelling reason to reject intrinsicness arguments? If you reword this exact notion, what you would get is it kills disads that have nothing to do with the plan. That is a good thing. We should have disads that have something to do with the plan. So that's the first objection. The second objection is that intrinsicness is blippy and not very well fleshed out. That is a reason to reject blippy intrinsicness arguments, not a reason to reject intrinsicness arguments. The final reason that people say is that it trades off with politics education. This one really grinds my gears. It is bad for the same reason that the kills all disads objection is bad, because what it secretly reveals is that the politics disad is not a real reason not to do anything ever. Like, the message you're sending by saying don't defund the police because it trades off with infrastructure is don't solve racism because it's hard. That sucks. That does not get at the should question. It's like, it does not address the resolutional issue whatsoever. Also, focusing on politics is dumb. If you only think about politics because you cut politics cards, you are hopeless. You need to read about politics for intrinsic reasons, not because you think it will help you win the politics disad. Also, it makes you really cynical, which is studies. That's this card here that I'm not going to read, but you can feel free to skim it. That's the rest of what I wanted to say. So, any questions about anything intrinsicness related?
I had a question about the first counterinterpretation.
Yeah.
Would arguing that justify the neg reading like any disad that applied to any AF under the topic?
It would not. arguably. It gets close to doing that, but it arguably would not, because we're still not saying that we're defending the whole topic. We're saying that the plan, we're saying that the burden of the neg is to disprove the whole topic. So we're kind of resolving the objection that affirmative fiat power is based on the resolution by only relying on affirmative fiat power that is within the bounds of the resolution. So it's less that like the AF can only win if they prove the whole resolution is true. It's that since we're talking about the plan as an example of the resolution, and since affirmative fiat power comes from the resolution, we should focus on the resolution primarily as a way to limit the intrinsicness arguments the AF can make. Really, all of these are somewhat arbitrary and not super grounded in anything. This one's probably the least arbitrary because it is grounded in the resolution, which is a thing that we are handed down from up on high. But the rest of the stuff is all kind of arbitrary and somewhat made up, which like you're gonna have, that's like an argument that the neg should make in response to these counter interpretations. But that is just kind of a thing that you have to deal with, because it's like you're using this stuff to screen out a bunch of offense. And that's fine.
That card used in the last concerns, what purpose was it on the slide? Like, why?
The one that's up right now?
Yeah. I don't know.
If the other team says that it's really, it's really sad to lose politics disads because they're not intrinsic, this card is saying debating about politics disads is stupid because it makes you cynical and disempowered. I don't know. That's just an argument that I like about the politics disad that I think is funny. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to talk to you about going back on the counter interpretation. Can you explain the intrinsicness test must be stable text, be limited in number? It was like from there and like the other one proportional. I didn't really like the last three. I didn't really understand that well.
Okay, the third one is literally just intrinsicness has to work like a perm. You have to like say what you're saying. You can't just be like disads have to be intrinsic. So for example, if you're giving a 2AC to the politics disad, you would literally be like, intrinsicness test, do the plan and pass infrastructure spending. It solves because reason. Intrinsicness is a good standard, reasons, right? So the reason that's good is because part of the concern is that people will change their explanation of the intrinsicness argument if it's super vague, and they'll like evolve it from speech to speech in a way that makes it really hard to debate, and having a text solves that problem. Limited in number is kind of like conditionality. So you just don't want too many intrinsicness tests because you don't want the AF to be too shifty. You don't want to divide up the debate too much because people will try to focus on individual parts and then, The fourth one I wouldn't worry about because it's stupid. The fifth one is just, sorry, what?
In and out. I don't know if that's just me.
Sorry, what? You said you're cutting in and out? Wait, so can you hear me? Okay. Well, I guess I'll just re-say the fifth one because that's the other one you were interested in, because the fourth is stupid because that sucks. Oh, is he gone? I think he's gone. RIP. Other questions. I will revisit that one if he returns. Yes, F indeed.
I just had a clarifying question. So you, the first one was logical intrinsicness, and then what was the other one that requires evidence?
Empirical intrinsicness.
Okay, thanks.
I guess I just have a question again about the politics, like this ad. So would the intrinsicness argument be like, even if like this specific bill doesn't get passed, it could just pass like a different thing that has to do with infrastructure with the plan?
No, they could pass the specific bill. I mean, so if it was that kind of gets at the logical versus empirical thing, because if it was a different bill that did something else, you'd have to prove that it solves. Like the neg has not already said that it solves, whereas the specific bill, the neg has already said that it solves. So it's like it's kind of up to you in terms of what specific thing you want to say. makes the disad not intrinsic. But yeah, either way works. I would say the logical route is less fraught, both theoretically and substantively, whenever it is available for you to take.
Sorry about that, Truth. I was going in and out. I don't know what happened.
Oh, you're
But
all good.
yeah, I caught what you said on the intrinsicness test must be stable. Like that makes sense. But what about like the last two? Like what do they vastly say?
So the fourth one is dumb. I would not worry about the fourth one. It's a thing that I just included because it was there in a bunch of old papers, and I just threw it in there because it felt, it was weird. But you should never actually say it. The fifth one is just saying. So do you know how like agent counterplans illegitimate is an argument?
Yeah.
So this is basically the same thing except for intrinsicness. So like one of the reasons why people say agent counterplans are illegitimate is because one decision maker cannot make two different agents act. So like for the state's counterplan, there's nobody who can make both the states and the federal government do something because nobody's in charge of both of them. There's only people who are in charge of each, right? So in this world, it's kind of the same thing where like if the AF got agent counterplans, or if the AF got agent intrinsicness arguments, they could basically imagine that the worlds in which the AF happens, in which other agents reacted to the AF positively, even though that is something that nobody endorsing the AF actor can ever control, So like this relations is that example. If the plan hurts Japan relations and that causes Japan to proliferate, somebody could literally be like, I am imagining a world in which the plan happens and Japan does not proliferate, and therefore that is the world that is the best, so I should win. And that's obviously ridiculous because nobody can control both what the federal government does and what Japan does. So that would suck. So the remedy to that is the AF is only allowed to make intrinsicness arguments about extra stuff that the same actor as the plan can do, which is, in this case, the federal government.
Say that last line one more time.
The scope of what the AF can make an intrinsicness argument about is limited to what the actor that did the plan can do. So in this case, the federal government did the plan, so the intrinsicness argument can only add actions by the federal government. You can't add actions by other people or other countries.
Truth, how would you answer number 4, the one that you said was stupid?
Like what is proportionally utopian? There's no way to know. Like it's like there's no measuring stick for utopianness. So it's bullshit. Like it represents a reasonable idea, which is part of the issue that people had originally with intrinsicness was that it allowed the AF to propose wildly disproportionate remedies to the problems that the neg advanced with the AF. So like, for example, the thing I said about how the AF could be marginally bad for food prices, but if the AF just gets to imagine a world in which the plan happens and trillions of dollars are spent on food subsidies, that's a disproportionate remedy to the problem that has been pointed out with the AF. So this thing is designed to be like, oh, we're screening that out, except the remedy that it is using to do that is bad because it's meaningless. How do we know how utopian something is? Also, the whole point of Fiat is to make the question of utopianism not relevant, so who cares?
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Also, do the intrinsicness arguments apply to Fiat? Like if they're like, oh, just like you could do this other thing to solve it, and if it was the money like part, could they be like, oh, the U.S. federal government would never do that?
No. So this is part of what is different about intrinsicness arguments, right? Because with an empirical intrinsicness argument, like let's say the disad says the plan causes overpopulation, right? The AF could advance an intrinsicness argument that is like, do the AF and give out birth control to solve overpopulation, right? That is an empirical intrinsicness argument. So the neg would have to respond to that by saying that birth control fails to address overpopulation. The AF could advance an argument about birth control without saying anything about intrinsicness at all. They could just say birth control access is increasing, which will solve the link, right? So the version of the argument that you're talking about is just the version that anybody can normally make by saying that something else can happen that solves the disad impact, right? with a politics dissad, people say this all the time. People read a dissad about infrastructure spending in the economy, and people will say, like, something else will solve infrastructure or something else will solve the economy, right? So that does not require you to win intrinsicness, and that's what you're talking about. Intrinsicness kind of adds on this additional element of, are there other things that the federal government can do that resolve this trade-off?
Okay, thanks.
But we're not fiating those things. We're just imagining, are there other things that could solve the trade-off? Because if there are other things, then the link has failed the intrinsicness test, and we should not consider the link. That's all that matters, right? Because if we were fiating it, we would be able to win by saying that other stuff outweighs their dissad because it's so good. But that would be bad, right? Because that would let the app tack on infinite advantages, and that's not how anything works. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
It's not fiat. We're just testing if the link is intrinsic. It's through an exercise that is admittedly very similar in appearance to fiat, but it is not fiat because we're just checking if there's trade-offs that are real, much like perms. You all can feel free to dip, by the way. I don't mean to hold you because I know I'm aggressively over the time, but if you want to keep asking me questions, you can feel free to do that.
What is an example of a dissad to the defund the police plan that would not be solved by an intrinsicness argument?
The crime dissad.
What would an example, like how an AF would use the intrinsicness argument to beat like the politics dissad this year for like the 2020 election?
It's rougher with elections because we have some external actors who are reacting to stuff. So whatever intrinsic consequence that is not based on a policy action that Trump would do. So like a dissad that was like, you get Trump reelected and that makes the US look really bad on the world stage just because Trump inherently looks like an idiot. That dissad is intrinsic, right? Because the plan causes an external reaction by voters and they react in a way that causes Trump to get reelected, which has certain inherent consequences for America's image. If the dissad was the plan causes Trump to get reelected and Trump makes the choice to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and that causes warming, that dissad is arguably not intrinsic because you could do the AF and not withdraw from the Paris Agreement. But so it depends.
Okay,
Couldn't
thank
you
you.
like have the USFG pass a plan that's like not popular so that Trump loses? I don't know.
Potentially, that would be an empirical intrinsicness argument that you could advance, and then you would have to prove that the link turn effect from the extra thing you've tacked on outweighs the link from the thing that the plan does. But the neg would be able to answer that by saying, you know, the neg would be able to say the neg would be able to answer that by saying that criminal justice reform is key, or the plan is key to the election. So whatever extra thing you do is not as relevant. So the link still matters. And then, again, the neg is rewarded for having specific cards, which is good. All right. Good stuff, folks. Enjoy lunch, and I'll see some of you in lab.